Serious. What is the creepiest, most blood-chilling thing you or someone you know have ever experienced? Part 2. I was in Vegas last year with my brother. We both like to party hard, still in our 20s. Walking down the strip, I see two guys with backpacks on. I know what that means, I say. Damn, wish we had some weed. They immediately turn around and offer us other things as well, and we took down his number to get other things later in the night. Hours later, after tons and tons of booze and stuff, we call this guy up for more. When we met these two guys, they were on foot the second time, though we had to meet them in front of a hotel because they were driving. So he tells us to hop in for a few so we can get what we need without people watching. Now at this point, my brother and I are fucked up and don't realize what's happening until it starts to get dark. We had only been driving for 10 minutes, but we were obviously off the strip, away from the lights, people, anything. This guy is driving like a goddamn maniac, with music blasting, so it was a bit distracting. My brother finally asks them where we're going. They say we're heading to a liquor store real quick and then they'll drop us back off, but it seems like we're in the middle of nowhere. Finally realizing the situation we're in, we open the doors, well we're stopped at a light, and run to the only thing we see, a gas station. We flag down a cab that drove by a few minutes later, which he says is illegal, but we were obviously in need of help. After we told him what happened, he calmly tells us, "There's no liquor store over here." It was the worst and best feeling ever. We narrowly escaped God knows what and stayed silent for the rest of the night. This didn't happen directly to me, but is still one of the most unsettling events to happen to my family. I was 10 and my brother was 7. During these years, we shared a room with bunk beds. We lived in a 3-bedroom 2-story apartment. One night, my mother was out on the front porch reading, and my little brother runs up to the front door, soaking wet and in his underwear. Understand that the front door was the only possible way he could have gotten outside, and it was locked and deadbolted. He was too small to unlock the ground story windows, and my mother was facing the sliding glass doors, which no one came through, and the only remotely accessible second-story windows were locked from the inside. Right after he ran up to the front door, a college-age kid rode up on his bicycle. Apparently he had been riding home from work and saw my brother standing in the sprinklers in the elementary school next door to the apartment complex we live in. When he called out to my brother started and after a few seconds ran off back home. From what my father says about that night, there was literally no way he could have gotten to the front door and unlocked the deadbolt. My dad was in the front hall working on a bookshelf right in front of the front door from the time he put us to sleep to the time my brother arrived. The only things my brother remembers from that night are going to sleep, a bright light, and waking up at the school. The event itself is crazy as shit, but what unnerves me is that anyone could have found my brother, but luckily it was a normal concerned person. I have two, each one creepy, blood-chilling in its own unique way. I was born and raised in the country outside a small northeastern Indiana town. I lived in a house that my great-great-great-great-grandfather and his brothers built, as well as 4 other homes directly around my house, where his brothers and their wives lived back in their time. So, by the time I lived in it as a child, it was well into 100 years old and had been remodeled by my grandma and grandpa in the 1970s. So before we lived there, my maternal grandparents lived there. My grandpa was diagnosed with idiopathic cystic fibrosis of the lungs way back in the early 1980s. I was born in 1989, and in 1990 he was blessed with receiving the first lung transplant in northern Indiana. At a very young age I have 2 distinct memories of him being home, with oxygen tubes in his nose, and pulling his oxygen tank around the house to sit in his favorite rocker recliner. He passed away in 1991 from rejection. So, the creepy part. Back in 2006, I was pregnant with my first child and near my due date. It was during the day and I was really uncomfortable and my hip's lower back was hurting. So I decided to drive to mom and dad's and take a nap in their water, thinking the heat may help. So, I get there and mom and I sat in the kitchen, off from the living room, to talk for a few minutes. During a lull in conversation, I distinctly hear a squeak squeak like squeaky tires. I kind of nonchalantly look around to see where the noise could be coming from. I don't see anything. I glance at my mom and see she's looking around too. Right as I'm about to ask her if she hears that, I see from the corner of my eye a figure walk past the entryway to the kitchen, walking into the living room. Since I was already looking at mom, hence why I saw it out of the corner of my eye, I could see she saw something as well as her eyes got that deer in headlights look and her face went pale. She looked at me and put her finger over her closed mouth like a SHH sound, and we both stood up quietly and walked to the kitchen living room hall entryway and looked into the living room. In the living room, the rocker recliner mom had was rocking back and forth like someone was sitting in it rocking. I looked back at mom with a "Are you fucking seeing this?" expression just in time to see her hands fly up to her open mouth. I snap my head back around and plainly see my dad. For at this time 15 plus years, grandfather, mom's dad, sitting in the chair, rocking, for about 2 rocks. I quickly glance back at mom to make sure she's seeing this and look back and he was gone and the chair was completely still. Legit freakiest thing that has ever happened to me, was not scared, was just in disbelief. So glad my mom was there or I would have thought I'd gone insane. Story 2 is completely different. So, lived in the same house except this time I was around 8/9 and my sister's rooms were upstairs in our house and my parents' room was downstairs. This particular night I was sick and my parents let me sleep on the couch in the living room. Somewhere around 3-4 a.m. I remember waking up because I heard someone come in the front door, which opens directly into the living room. I remember opening my eyes to see someone walking through the living room and into the kitchen. And I seemingly fell back asleep for a few minutes. The next thing I knew I was woken up to red and blue lights flashing through the house. Then I hear my dad and mom's hushed whispers and dad arguing with what sounded like another man. Again, young me just fell back asleep. Come to find out the next morning, apparently a man who was fleeing the cops had pulled into our driveway and walked into our house. And was trying to convince my dad to tell the cops he was his dad and this was his house. Yeah, dad def did not do that and guy ended up in jail. A few weeks ago I was up late celebrating the end of exams with some video games. I was living with my mom and my 96-year-old grandpa until school wrapped up. My grandpa regularly gets up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom or get a glass of water and when he does, so his feet make a light thud sound that I can hear from the basement. So this night, around 2 a.m. I hear grandpa's feet hit the floor, practically on schedule. About 30 seconds later I hear a much louder thud. I knew that wasn't normal, so I ran upstairs to see what had happened, thinking he had knocked over a chair or something. He actually collapsed. When I turned on the light he was lying on his stomach trying to get up. I went over to help him up and my mom came downstairs to investigate. I sat him down in a chair and he was somewhat responsive. Well, as responsive as you can be when your hearing is almost completely gone. For about 15 seconds. Then he started convulsing and soiling himself and doing this odd lip smacking thing. I recognized it as a seizure and told mom to call 911 while I tried to tend to him. He was convulsing for about 30 seconds before he stopped and started gasping for air, each breath taking longer than the last until he stopped breathing. Right there in my arms he just stopped breathing. I watched his lips turn blue, I couldn't find a pulse, and I watched the color flush from his face. And I froze. I had no idea what to do at all. I was relaying all this to my mom to tell the 911 operator and mom was losing her shit. The 911 operator told me to lay him down on the ground because she was gonna walk me through CPR. So I pick him up clean out of the chair, all 175 pounds of dead weight, and lay him on the ground and get ready to do CPR. And just before I start, he opens his eyes and starts breathing again. The ambulance got there not long after and I'm shouting at him trying to keep him calm and awake. Did I mention he's almost deaf? By the time he was in the stair chair he was joking with the paramedics that it's too cold to be outside in his PJs. He doesn't remember anything between when he went down and when he was being loaded into the ambulance. I envy him for that because it's something I'll never forget. We had a break-in in the home I lived in as a child. I was about 5 or so and I used to come home from school and I would be alone as my sister was at school and my parents were at work. The house was at the bottom of a long driveway too, with a big ass yard and a huge bush with a river behind it, so it was kind of isolated. One day I came home from school, down the driveway as usual, went to unlock the gate and noticed that our front door was broken, but the gate wasn't. As I said, I was only 5, so I wasn't very smart. I proceeded to open the gate to go in, and as I entered, I heard someone's running out the back door. I went into the house and saw that the burglars had broken in through a back window and just took everything. Point of the story is that they were still in the house when I arrived home, and when they heard the front gate opening, they fled out the back as they probably thought it was my dad who is a police officer. Had they known it was just a 5-year-old kid, who knows what would have happened to me. Makes my fucking blood run cold just thinking about it. When I was 26 and 6 months pregnant, I went to my dad's house to pick up his mail. My dad was working overseas, but my older and more irresponsible brother was still living there. I had noticed his car was gone, so when I entered the house and heard movement in his room upstairs, I thought it was his girlfriend. As I was rummaging through the mail, I noticed that the movement upstairs had stopped and I heard the floorboards creaking, as if someone was trying not to be noticed. Something told me to hide, so I ran down the hall to my dad's room and saw that his window was broken and glass was all over his floor. As I was realizing this, I heard the stairs creaking, so I ran to my dad's bathroom. From there I had a clear view down the hall to a wall, where the landing from the stairs was, and I could see unfamiliar legs with long black basketball shorts and the bottom of a large red t-shirt standing there, starting to slowly bend, as if to quietly peek down the hall into a room to escape back out of the house through the broken window. Thankfully, he took a chance and ran out of the front door. Luckily enough, I didn't lock the front door behind me as I usually do. I don't know what I would have done if I would have had to confront him. It makes me sick to try to imagine the fear a child would have in that situation. Though I grew up in SW Houston, a leaf, which is no stranger to gang activity, especially young teenagers, adults trying to rep street gangs like the Bloods. Hence the red shirt, I had never had any negative experiences. However, after that day, I never went back to my dad's house without my husband or brother there. So, this happened senior year of high school. My best friend and I were at her house, which was way up in one of the canyons, and she had a long, winding driveway. We had been there all day and her mom had gone out, and she and I were supposed to go meet a couple friends in Hollywood that night. Anyways, we had been goofing around all day and watching scary movies at Wetnut, and we started to get ready. Her bathroom had one of those his or her double sink deals, so she was near one and I was at the other. All of a sudden I got the creepiest feeling, like all of the hair on my arms stood up and I had this sudden feeling of panic. To this day it is the most terrified I have ever been. I was putting on eyeliner when it happened and I caught her eye in the mirror and said, "We need to leave. Right now." I thought she would be like, "What? You're being ridiculous," or what have you, but instead she said, "I know." My blood ran cold when she said it. We left so quickly that we just grabbed what was in front of us. We booked it out of her house and down the driveway, which we weren't supposed to be on. Her mom had just had it repaved and her car was parked down on the street. We rounded the curve in the driveway and there was an SUV parked dead center in the middle of the street without its lights on. Suddenly, the lights turned on full blast, the SUV blared its horn and took off. We scrambled the rest of the way down, totally ruining the new paving, and were getting into her car and calling the police when her mom pulled up right behind us. To this day, I do not know if it was a robber or what, but the fact that she and I both got the sense of dread at the exact same time creeps me out to no end. When I was younger, around 8 or 9, I went over to my best friend's house for a sleepover. Her parents had just recently gone through a messy divorce and her mom reached out to mine and thought it was a good idea she had some friends to spend the night with since she was apparently experiencing frequent night terrors. I only found this out until later on. We'll refer to her as Elle. So there's about 6 of us and we're in Elle's attic spending the night. After all the junk food and gossip, we decided to sleep since it was around 3 a.m. Right before deciding to sleep, Elle mentioned the reason why her parents were getting a divorce is because her dad cheated on her mom with the mom's hairdresser and the mom kicked him out and changed all the locks. She said she was scared of him showing up because of how loud he would always yell. I felt so sorry for her having to go through that. We all tried to make her feel better and safe, but then decided it was time to sleep. I'm usually the last one to fall asleep, so as I was drifting off I feel someone nudging my shoulder asking me if I'm okay, and I said, "Yeah, I'm fine. Why?" Still with my eyes closed, and the person says, "Wake up. Don't sleep yet." I can't sleep, so I open my eyes to see Elle standing above me with her eyes closed. I told her she already looked like she's asleep and to go back to bed because I'm too sleepy. She nudged my shoulder again and then started crying loudly, then walked away to her side of the attic and went back in her bed. I looked around thinking everyone would wake up for sure, but no one did, and she stopped crying as soon as she got into bed. I stayed there frozen for so long thinking she would wake up again or do something different. Then I got worried, so I walked over to her side and happened to look outside the window to see a man standing by a tree in their front yard, just standing in all black and looked like he was waiting. I never made it to her side to check on her. I sprinted back to where I was and just sat there. Needless to say, I never slept that night, and to this day I'm still confused as to why no one else woke up when she cried. And why she made it to my side without making any noise, seeing as the floor creaked a lot anytime someone moved. She had no idea what I was talking about when I asked her in the morning. Her mom denied everything. I felt like I was going crazy until my mom explained her night terrors to me. She freaked when I told her about the man waiting outside. We assumed it was Elle's dad, but who knows. I was on a business trip from San Fran to LA last day in town. I finish early and head to, the beach. Stop by a payphone, call the airline, may I please have a later flight so I can watch the sunset from the beach. Nice airline lady says it's done. Later that night, I get home. My wife is laughing her ass off. I knew you weren't dead, she kept saying. Turns out, the owners of the company I worked for, the same guys that had bought the original tickets for the flight, had been calling her, telling her how sorry they were for her loss. My supervisor was in tears, and wifey is laughing, telling them all I'm not dead. My original flight home was that Southwest Airlines flight from the 80s, where a disgruntled baggage handler had gotten on the plane with a pistol and put a bullet in the backs of the heads of the two pilots. The plane crashed and burned, killing all on board, near San Luis Obispo. It was a good sunset on the beach. Growing up, my parents were in the US Navy. When I was 8 or 9, we moved to Flower Bluff Naval Air Station outside of Corpus Christi, Texas. From the get-go, my older brother and I hated the place. We both would have the sensation of being watched. There were odd noises and smells randomly. We would hear chattering between people. Not loud enough to hear what was said, but loud enough to hear distinct voices. We shared a room for a bit. At night, we would hear a constant tapping noise. It reacted to us yelling at it, telling it to stop, or whatever. Sometimes it would stop, others it would get more intense, like it was mocking us. It would frighten my brave big brother to the point of going to sleep in our parents' room. I was so paralyzed with fear I would just lay my eyes closed and pretend to sleep. Even though he insisted I should get out with him. We would see moving shadows. On 2 very distinct and memorable occasions, I saw full-figured shadowy apparitions. Things would be misplaced, something even our parents noticed and blamed on my brother or me. I am pretty sure my parents heard or saw things too, but either just shrugged it off as adults do, or didn't make a deal of it to not frighten us kids. The place was haunted, bottom line. I remember going to visit my grandparents in Florida one summer. It felt great to be out of there. I had a long discussion with my mom one day that started with me asking what it meant to be paranoid and me telling her I thought that maybe I was mentally ill. That's when she started taking our complaints more seriously. Imagine your 10-year-old telling you he thinks he is paranoid, sees, and hears things. It wasn't fun for her, I am sure. Dad still shrugged it off and said it was overactive imaginations and the horror movies Mom rented for us when he had an overnight duty shift. Things stayed constant like that for a while. All the odd occurrences. My brother became a teenager and needed his own space. So I moved into what was then the computer office room. The computer stayed and will be important in just a bit. We had a dog named Sally, who I treasured when I had to sleep alone in that room. She kept me safe and sane. She knew something was up. She was never more than a foot behind me. She slept on my bed and played on the bath mat when I showered. She was always there. On more than a few occasions, when I was in that room, she would growl at the closet, at the window, or the corner across from my bed. I believe she kept me safe from something angry, if not pure evil. If not for that little mutt, I damn well could have lost my mind. She was my savior and I will cherish her forever. Her ashes sit in a pine box in my man cave at home as I type this. One summer night, she had woken me up. She was trying to get under my blanket, pawing and nuzzling. She had her ears back, hair standing, and was shaking and whining. Something scared her to her doggy core. It scared me too. I closed my eyes hard and pretended we were elsewhere. I managed to drift back to sleep. Sleep was interrupted again later that night. I awoke to what I can now describe as a cacophony. The window behind my bed had slammed closed. I opened my eyes in surprise. The old computer was on. It was a DOS computer. For you kids, there wasn't a graphic interface. You had to type in commands to open programs. The keyboard was clicking away with random characters typing onto the screen. I howled in fear. I cried for my mom and dad. Mom tells me she thought I was being murdered. My still skeptical dad came rushing in. He saw the computer. Saw the characters appear on the screen. Heard the mechanical clicking of keystrokes. He lunged at the power supply and turned it off. The computer remained on for just a few seconds, but it seemed like forever. As the screen went dead, there was this noise. I still can hear it when I'm alone in the dark. It was this guttural groan. It sounded as if someone was being choked with lungs full of water. It was the most frightening thing that happened. Then the clicking stopped. as did my father's skepticism. A few days later some naval officers came to visit. I didn't know at the time, but one was a child psychologist, the other was a chaplain. They talked to my brother and me together and separately. I remember how odd some questions were. Like asking if adults had ever touched us. Then we talked openly about things we saw and heard in the house. The chaplain seemed most interested. Brother and I both had a few visits with the psychologist in the hospital as well. After their first visit though, we stayed in a Holiday Inn on the beach. It was such a relief. We never went back to that house. In a rather unprecedented event, and after several talks with the chaplain and doctor, the Navy granted my parents an allowance to pay for off-base housing. Turns out our complaints weren't the only ones. For years there had been numerous claims in housing, the sailors' work areas, all over the base. Ours was probably just the most serious. The housing area was demolished not long after my dad was restationed and rebuilt on the other side of the base, until the base itself was closed down at the end of Clinton's second term. Years after, when the internet was burgeoning, I did some research with my brother. Turns out in 1900 or 1901, I don't recall exactly, the area was hit by a hurricane. It was one of the largest civilian loss of life events in American history, only to be beaten by Hurricane Andrew. The base we lived on was hit hard with hundreds of deaths in a small area. I think that the last moan I experienced with my dad came from a drowning victim's lost soul. I can still hear it. It still chills me every time. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, please drop a like, and to stay up to date with my latest videos, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the button under this video.